I was trying to think about how many times I've interviewed you. I think this is number 3 for a church conversation. But I've known Kelly, like 3-4 years now, right? And we got the chance to, well, I would say collaborate, but I am not an artist. And so the collaboration was in the blessing. But I've known Kelly through his art for quite a while. I think the first image of yours that I saw was the Trinity that Mark Bazzuti Jones commissioned. And we got to have a really fun conversation about that during the pandemic. I might link it if we put this up online. But there, in the conversation, we heard Mark, this really wonderfully Jamaican priest's perspective on why he commissioned an image of the Trinity that centered a Black woman based on the Rublev Trinity, and then had 3 feminine figures seated at a table with a rainbow flag on it. It was a beautiful image. And I remember seeing that the first time and being like, oh, something playful is going on here in Kelly's art. And then it was through the pandemic, I discovered that Kelly and I at one point actually lived across the street from one another. And by the time we got to know each other, Kelly and his partner, Evie, lived just a few blocks away. And it was through the commissioning of the icon you can see over there, Mama. We can move, I think that's my son's art, out of the way for Kelly.
Which is great.
But Evie commissioned Mama after the death of George Floyd, and then Kelly was looking for a community for it to be, and it ended up that Mama stayed in St. Louis and is still up at the altar of my former church. But I really thought this is a congregation that thinks a lot about images of the sacred, that thinks a lot about the playfulness that can be there as we talk about icons. And I've really wanted to bring Kelly to New Mexico. I'll tell a story in a little bit about bringing Kelly to El Paso as well. But I thought I would let Kelly introduce himself, and maybe I could ask you to tell the story about how you came about painting your first icon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to St. Michael's and all angels and Michael Angell. I still think that's so ironic. And having Evie and I here this week, it's been absolutely important, incredible, and it's just an honor to be here. So I just need to say that outright. But so I'm actually a pastor's kid. I come from Chicagoland area, and I've always been making art. Covered the bulletins as a kid as my dad was preaching. And little images on the hymnals or whatever. But I ended up going to Greenville University and studied religion and art. And as with most college students, I kind of had a choice either to move back in with my parents in Chicago or go somewhere else. And I chose to go somewhere else. But where that ended up being, just through happenstance, was Athens, Ohio. And there I met one of my best friends now, Paul Clever, and his partner Sarah at the time. And they had started a community. And in this community, centered around the prayers, the Book of Common Prayer every day. But the real mission of the place was a food pantry farm. And growing up in Chicago, I grew up in a very evangelical tradition. And really the spirit, my dad and I talk about this all the time now, but my spirituality, I feel like, was really about transcendence, almost like Jesus and I versus the world, which is a really damaging way to view the world. But at this food pantry farm and in this community, as we were growing food for the food insecure, there was actually people who were in shelters who would join us in that work, growing food and so having these conversations about everything over weeding a bed of carrots to waking up early and milking a cow at 5:30 a.m. to sharing food amongst the table, and also doing Eucharist services at the farm. It really showed me that the way that we use things is of the utmost spiritual significance, and that my relationship, my spirituality, stopped really being about transcendence and more about communion, engagement, embodiment, and how we live and how we are together. So it was a really profound time, but it was during that time and these kind of realizations that Father Tom, who lived with us, had said, I'd always been doing landscapes and portraits and what have you. But he said, have you ever tried painting an icon? And I was like, no, I haven't. And so I did what some of the people in this room did yesterday as we did our icon writing classes. I just started by tracing. And I can pick this one up because this is the one we did yesterday. But just started tracing over the lines and, these really older forms of icons and just, trying my hand at it. And I did that for a long time. Did that for a long time until I was trying to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. And as we were trying to be farmers and have a right relationship with earth, but also with the people and the community, my best friend Paul used to say, what did Jesus mean by consider the lilies of the field? Like, what does that mean for us as we're doing this? And so that became the focus of my first icon. And so I'll say it was a good first try. The lines are like really shaky if you see it. And one of our Franciscan brother friends, Brother Jerry, he likes to say that Jesus almost looks surprised that the lilies are in his hand. But not to diminish it, but I think what was beautiful about it is that the community embraced it. And because it was a part of our common experience and part of what we were talking about and how we wanted to see the world in which we were living and farming in and all these things. And so it showed me that, this big question that Evie and I have been asking about a lot lately is, and it seems like a simple question, is what is our church art for? And we can talk more about that. But that initial first creation of an icon showed me that really art can be a placeholder for our thought and our prayer, but most importantly, our action. And that was really a kind of the catalyst that kind of snowballed into standing here before you today.
So I'm going to just lead with your question. What is church art for?
Yeah. Well, I think, so now, what is our church art for? Is it glorified wallpaper? Or can it actually be something that brings us together and causes us to see in a new way? And so, and that's really been a big question. Again, it's simple. But I think what's happened is that I'll talk about before. So growing up in this evangelical tradition, we didn't have a lot of art. But we had 3 pieces of artwork in the church I grew up in. And they're all by the same artist. And his name's Warner Sallman. And you probably know the one piece it's like a white Jesus with flowing hair. It's like a 70s yearbook photo kind of thing, So there's that, the head of Christ. And what's interesting about that piece, I learned later, is that image was the Salvation Army printed a color image card of that and gave it to over 10 million U.S. troops before they went over to fight in World War II. So there's that. But then the other image was, you might have seen, which was Jesus knocking on the door, which was strangely above the baby changing table in the nursery. It was really, really odd placement with that. But what was interesting, and this is kind of a broader conversation that's been happening in the church, is about representation. Not only in our congregations as people and how we're made up as communities, but also in the artwork and how that reflects us, but how we're going to then see one another and then therefore see God and see Christ, right? And so those thinking about that is that, unfortunately, in America, we've really locked Jesus into one image, a blonde, white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired man, And so what's really amazing about being an iconographer specifically, and for Evie and I, and what's been a gift and then a gift this week with you all, is that iconography is a very communal art. Like, Evie and I get to engage in conversations with communities in a way I don't think I would have done otherwise, doing other work. And, just one example, we had a commission to do the Transfiguration and Pentecost at a St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Salisbury, North Carolina. And we met with this arts committee. And they were talking about the image and what they were hoping for. And at one point, one woman was talking about the Transfiguration, this glorious moment in the Gospels where Jesus is like exuding light and on the mountaintop. And she says, I just want his robes to be really white, just strikingly white. And a Black woman in the group was saying, I'm very uncomfortable with that, very uncomfortable with that. And so, the group kind of took a second and was like, okay. And so we started talking about like what could change with this. And finally, the woman who had spoke up before, this Black woman, she said, what if it's not whiteness, but brightness, the brightness of Christ? How could we translate that? And so what we end up doing is we end up covering the idea was to cover Christ's robes in a silver leaf. And so what ended up being beautiful is that when it actually went up, eventually when it was finished, it was crazy because when the light would hit it, it would just reflect in all these places that you wouldn't expect, which felt more true to what the Transfiguration actually was. So it became a gift, and therefore it became that cobbling together, that kind of talking about representation and language and how we see Christ, but also the uncomfortableness of the images and how that reflects in us. Then therefore it became a gift to Evie and I, experiencing that with them, but it caused them to have a conversation that they wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. So that's just kind of one example, kind of how this is, it's church art can be a way for us to see the thing we might not be seeing in ourselves, but also might not be seeing in the story and in the personhood of each other. And therefore, that causes us to kind of ask questions of who is our neighbor, where is Christ in my own neighborhood, in the world, etc.
Yeah. I think that question of representation is so important in religious art. I'll never forget the first church I worked at. I did a wedding for a young couple, and the groom mentioned, or his family mentioned, that there was a portrait of his great-great-grandfather in our stained glass window. Because the people who got represented were the people who paid for the stained glass window, right? And so who we represent has been a question in the church for a long time. I wonder, and I want to get to a conversation about rule breaking in a minute, but before we leave the question of representation, you talked about the theological implication of the Transfiguration. Some of your images are really intentionally inclusive of folks who are often not seen in religious art. We had a good friend in the St. Louis area who said when she was a little girl, she wondered whether Black people went to heaven. She was a Black little girl. Because in all of the Episcopal churches she grew up in, she never saw a picture of a Black angel. And so the question was opened for her. And so when she was an adult woman, she commissioned a lot of art with Black angels in it. But what has been the community's reaction to, and I know the trolls, but have you had any stories of people surprised to see themselves represented in your work?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important pieces, and I kid about Christ consider the lilies, but really, when Evie and I started, we kind of had, or when I started, I got commissions from people in the church. Could you do St. Michael's for my nephew Michael? Could you do St. Catherine of Scotland? Just random saints, just kind of here and there. But when Trump was elected in 2016, and the rhetoric then, as it's happening now, unfortunately, of anti-stranger, anti-immigrant, Evie and I were just, gutted what was being said about immigrants and people that undocumented people that we had met and known. And Evie said, what if we could make an image that would really reflect the sacredness of like, we don't get to pick and choose who doesn't have the image of God within them. And Evie suggested the Holy Family. And so we ended up creating this, taking all the forms of iconography, the halos and the Holy Family image, but carrying those metaphors and symbols into the present in modern clothing as a Latinx family, fleeing in the desert, harkening back to the flight of Egypt. But having then put that out there, there was so much pushback from individuals, spiritual death threats, literal death threats to us. The same thing happened to Mama, and we can talk about that later. But Mike referenced it in the beginning, but what Father Mark Bazzuti Jones says is really eloquent. He says that, icons can be a window. They're called like a window to God or a window to a saint or someone who lived. And as we look at it, they're looking back at us. But icons can also be iconoclastic in the sense of breaking images. What Father Mark says that there's something about the image of God that will always be resisted. And there's something about the image of God that will always be crucified because we continue to crucify each other. And I think what's a problem, and I'm talking about the Church Catholic, is that for far too long the Church has neglected and even rejected those on the margins of society. And then when it complains about not having enough money, about not having enough people in their seats, whose problem is that? The gifts are there, the gifts of the people on the margins and who they represent, the stranger, the foreigner, people of all different orientations. And those people, they are gifts, but we just are failing to see. And so what can happen, and this has really been the focus of a lot of the icons that I want to do, and Evie and I are constantly talking about, we feel like churches are wanting to engage in, is really these images, and I'm not the only one making them, but are really challenging our sight. And, changing, and we can talk about the rules part of it, but challenging our sight and asking us, where is Christ in your neighborhood? Go walk around your neighborhood, and if you're looking for Christ, you'll probably find him. And so representing, Jesus and the Holy Family as Latinx immigrants, or a homeless family under overpass, to, these families that have been under the rubble in Gaza, right? And so these are the kind of images I think they're going to really impact us and ask the church to be what it is, which is a stranger in the world made up of strangers. Yeah.
Yeah, let's play with both that. So the death threats question, I was familiar with Kelly's art. Kelly's on Instagram. Go follow Kelly Latimore Icons, right? But I was familiar with Kelly's art. I think I even had a piece of Kelly's, like a reproduction, one of the ones that it's up on the wall. Those are both my copies of the stuff that Kelly has done, both Dr. King over there and Mama. But when Mama came about, we, in the midst of the pandemic, all wearing masks, when we had 5 people in the church, we brought Mama in and did a blessing of Mama and then put Mama up on the high altar at Holy Communion. And I was honestly stunned by how much vitriol came in the comments. It was, and not just, there are a number of people from the Orthodox world that can get really kind of frustrated with depictions of iconographic art, but there was some really hateful stuff that was being said. One of the things I found really important in the response was, I was in a community that was 40% African American, and part of the reason why we wanted Mama was that we didn't have any art in our church that represented Black people at all. It was a lot of white German Jesus in the stained glass, and that was about all that was on the wall. And so this was an important thing for our community, but I was amazed how my community came around Mama. And they also started commenting on Facebook and on Instagram and kind of, put in support. But we did, for a while, we had to call the U City Police and have them do an extra patrol on Sunday mornings while we were recording, because there were some local folks that were putting death threats in the comments. I do think that you're not gonna run into the kind of work that you're doing without pushback. I'm really sad that it is what it is, and having only tasted a little bit of it, I'm sad that you face it regularly. The rule-breaking question that I find really interesting is a question about how we make meaning. David Foster Wallace, the famous postmodern writer and literary critic, has this idea about poetry. And he says that a lot of modern free verse poetry, he calls it toxic, because you can't make meaning. He says it's just a bunch of kind of words, right? He says when you want to make meaning in writing, it helps to have an ordered and disciplined system. And when you have that ordered and disciplined system, your system of rhyme or how many verses, then you can break the rule and make meaning, right? And I find that really compelling in your icons, that you are taking a vernacular, you're taking a set of rules, a way of doing icons. I think there are people in this room who have done icon workshops where it's like, this is the process, and you put this down first, and these are the exact dimensions, right? And you're definitely breaking some of those rules. What are some of the most compelling rules that you've broken in your mind? Like, what are you still thinking about?
Well, I think one of the things that Evie and I have talked a lot about and encountered in a lot of communities in our time, and so a lot of the rule breaking, just to speak on that first, you've heard the term, there's painting an icon, but the common term is writing an icon, So a lot of that was really, in the theology, was based on to trace these lines and to trace a scene, a biblical scene in iconography is really kind of, you're writing scripture. So to deviate from the line, you're changing the scripture. Like that's so for me, and when we're thinking about these different images or different, biblical scenes or images of saints, what have you, if I'm going to change something, I better have a good theological reason why. And even if I don't have a good one, at least, thinking about it and confronting it, at least, cobbling together kind of with community and other people and close people in our life, what's going on here. And I think one of the simplest things that we've broken very often with iconography, and it also, I don't know all of the reasons why, and it's actually really long-winded. We don't need to go into the theology behind it, but was the stoicism within all the faces. Very stoic, no emotion, no gleam in the eye. We talked about this yesterday at the icon writing class. But breaking that, we noticed that people wanted to connect to the images. And by bringing emotion into it, into faces, it's a really simple change. But I think a lot of the pushback from that was that it would lead you away from what's going on in the image. Like by seeing the emotion, it's going to take you away from the holiness of it. But I think that humanity is actually, Jesus doubled down being human, wounds it all. Like we desire that. So one of the funny ones was we did last year, we wanted to do a prodigal son icon. And again, wanted it to be representative of a Middle Eastern father and his son at first. But we looked at a lot of the old icons, and the father is like waiting for his son to come home. It's this big moment, and they're just kind of like seventh grade like dance, kind of like fly for each other. And we happened to be my mom was there, and my mom, she's such a dear and pure soul. And I showed her one of the old traditional icons. She goes, "They don't look happy to see each other at all." And so we created this image where there was the father. We just want to put so much emotion in his face, like on the brink of happiness and tears at the same time, and they're embracing. And the son is just like his hands in his head and just ready to just weep. And I don't know, people really connected to that, and I think it's because it is. It's just human. It's just a part of what it is. What it is, and having certain. One of the first times I've painted teeth in an icon was the most recent one of Gustavo Gutierrez, who's this, father of liberation theology, but he was everything we heard, and Father Yerrick, who we met in El Paso, knew him personally, such a happy, jovial person, and, talking about these really hard truths about, the church and the poor and oppressed, but, such an amazing person. Yeah, I want to show that in his face. I think, breaking those rules, it's not breaking the rules for rules' sake. It's breaking the rules so we can connect. And I think far too often the religion and church has really put a lot of forms in place that kind of keep us separated from each other. I think, all this really doesn't mean much without the relationships that make life worth living. And so I think for Abby and I, that's been a constant thing. And, one other image, and talked about this yesterday, is that Mama, originally the traditional Pietà in Byzantine, more so rather than Orthodox, but Mary in the Pietà images is looking at the dead Christ figure. But with everything, talking about George Floyd and everything that had happened, it just, something was off, and Evie rightly suggested, she's, what if the mother was actually looking at the viewer? And when we changed that simple thing, it completely changed the image. It was Mary looking at the viewer saying, what are we going to do so this doesn't keep happening? Like capturing that, our sons and our daughters are continually being murdered by the state 2,000 years later, and so I think, that was a theological reason to change that, to bring us to action and to compassion. And those are just a few, but I could go on.
Let's pivot a little bit because even the idea of an icon is not always uncontroversial.
Right.
And so could you talk a little bit about the commission that happened for the portrait of Matthew Shepard that's at the cathedral and that dialogue?
Yeah, so we had the honor to, unexpected, the LGBTQI members on staff at the National Cathedral for a long time had been wanting to create some kind of an icon or image of Matthew Shepard, who, for those who don't know, is actually interred at the National Cathedral. This young man who was murdered in Wyoming in 1998. Yeah. So we were asked by the cathedral to create this portrait, and one of the first meetings, we met with Judy and Dennis, Matthew's parents, over Zoom, which was incredible. But in talking with them, the cathedral had an idea of an icon. Matthew's parents were really uncomfortable with that. Dennis he's kind of a good old boy, and he's like, my son wasn't a saint. Like, he snuck out of the house. Like, he talked back to me. It was all this really dad, things. And so we wanted to honor that, but how do we play with the forms of iconography and what exists, but still honor what Judy and Dennis wanted, but also show the inherent sacredness of Matthew in his life as a gay young man in Wyoming and who he was. And so we had heard that, just as you talked this morning in your sermon about the prayers, which I've been there, it's incredible to see stuffed into the Western Wall. People continually, when they come to the National Cathedral, will have prayers that they leave at the Matthew's tomb, poems, all kinds of things. It's like, oh, it was so touching. And I just had this idea, it's like, what if those prayers actually became the halo that made up Matthew's image? And so when we suggested that, and Judy and Dennis then loved that idea and opened up, they had scanned hundreds and hundreds of letters that they had received from individuals across the country following Matthew's death. And so we were able to use these scans. There was a letter from Father Mike that was included in there, which is lovely. And just other pieces of, he was one of us. This could have been me. Matthew's life was sacred. My prayers are with you. Trans lives matter, gay lives matter. All these things that were written, and what ended up being pasting them, on the backdrop, almost containing Matthew in that way. And one, Judy was, as Matthew's mother, we went through so many drafts of his face. She, his hair was a little bit more fluffy and a little bit more blonde, and his ears need to be pointed. It doesn't quite look like him, and so we really just wanted it to be good. And she's still grieving, but it was a really beautiful, hard, really painstaking, but beautiful work that ended up coming of that. And one last story about it that kind of brought it all to kind of ahead was when my best friend Paul built the frame for the image, and we were in Ohio, and I had, we were still kind of finding letters, and we had kind of finished the image and was finally ready to varnish like a week before we were going to unveil it. And so I varnished it really quickly. We'll put a lot of varnish on it because we had this paper on it. We didn't want it to move. And it was kind of on a weird desk. It was kind of tilted, and I didn't realize that at the time. So the varnish actually ended up dripping, which is not good. You don't want varnish to drip. But when we looked at it, my buddy Paul and I, we noticed that the two drips were coming from Matthew's face down into his hands, which was a complete accident. And when we nervously unveiled the portrait to Judy and Dennis, I told Judy the story, and she was saying, well, actually, she was getting really emotional. She said that's when they found Matthew. He was the only way that they knew that he was a person, because he had been so brutally beat up, he was covered in blood where the two spots where tears were coming from his eyes, you could see his skin. It was like, ugh. And if this means something, and she goes, this is always happening with Matthew, like he's here. So I think that process, it's, again, it's, even though they didn't want him to be depicted as saint, I think the sacred and trying to, as a community, not only the staff, but also with Judy and Dennis Shepard, and that communality that came out of cobbling and trying to struggle with what the image was ended up being a pure gift, not only to them in the cathedral, but then to Evie and I too. Yeah.
What questions are there in the troop? Crakes.
In the Episcopal Church, who is considered a saint?
Oh, let me do out. So, in the Episcopal Church, we vote on our saints. So we inherited a good number of saints from the Roman Catholic Church. And so everybody who was sainted for the most part before the Reformation still counts to some degree or another. But the prayer book had a calendar of saints in it from the beginning. And so it's interesting, certain saints like St. Michael, it's an interesting thing to have an angel as a saint. I get tripped up, and Mandy and JP, when they were here, used to always include that line when we at the end of the Eucharistic prayer about with the saints and the angels. And it's, for me, it's really tricky to say with St. Michael and all the angels and the saints and all the angels, it sort of gets confusing. But that Saint's Day, St. Michael's Day, is really important in the life of the academic calendar. Like Oxford's fall semester is called the Michaelmas term. And it's an important thing. So we kept St. Michael at the Reformation. But since the Reformation and since the Episcopal Church got independence from the Church of England, we vote. And so to become a saint, to get a feast day in the Episcopal Church, you have to be voted on by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church twice. So you go through one round and another round. So Polly Murray would be the example. Kelly has an icon of Polly Murray. Polly Murray would be an example of a recently canonized saint in the Episcopal Church. And the bishops and the deputies, the two houses of our parliament, have to agree and vote the person through. And they have to do it twice. So the first time you go through, you get a feast day, but your name is in parentheses. And then when you get through the next one, they take the parentheses off, right? And so that it's this interesting process of there's not a secret of root counting miracles. It's votes, right? Committees. But generally, you want somebody who's already being honored in a local context to rise up. If there's already a local group of people honoring somebody's memory, that tends to help elevate their case in the pinch. What other question?
What icon did you leave at the shelter?
Oh, well, we did. So Father Yerrick, I mentioned Gustavo Gutierrez. He knew him personally, and we were going around the shelter, and what's happened is that there's kind of this patchwork quilt of random paintings that people, volunteers, and a few migrants had done in this. It's the area in El Paso where they first bring the migrants and refugees in to check them in and do paperwork. And so this is the first thing they see when they walk in. And it's just beautiful. Like there's like a 5-year-old's painting of themselves in there. There's all these different people. And so the fact that Father Yerrick said, he knew Gustavo and he had just passed, and he was someone who's such an advocate for the poor in his writing and life, seemed appropriate. And he was all excited to paint him in this kind of hallway of saints. So that's what we did. Yeah.
So Kelly and I had this collaborative relationship up in St. Louis, and I knew Kelly's at work really well. And when I came here last year, I went with Liz and Mike down to the shelter in El Paso, one particular shelter. And I'm being careful both in the sermon and today not saying the names of the shelter because we might put this online. Things are really sensitive right now.
Yeah.
But there's this one particular shelter that the Franciscans run that we were visiting this week. And when I first walked in there, they have all this art on the wall, some of it by 5-year-olds, but they'd also commissioned local
Yes, I should have said that.
students. And so I walk into this place and I see this incredible mural that's on the wall. It has the shelter and it has Franciscan brothers. 2 of them, it turned out, had actually been killed in Peru while they were serving there, who were Yerrick's brothers in Peru. And then there's an El Paso city bus arriving at the shelter, and there's immigrants on the bus, and among them are the Holy Family. And when I saw this, I was like, man, this is like what Kelly does. It's a slightly different style. It's a little bit more realistic, a little bit less iconographic. But this kind of looks like what Kelly would do. I'd really love to bring Kelly here someday. And we got started talking about taking a group down, and I talked with folks about, let's bring Kelly into St. Michael's too, and it worked out to bring Kelly down there. And tell them what happened when Father Yerrick said you this.
So we're touring around, and Father Yerrick heard I was an artist, but he didn't really know who I was. And so he's like, you could paint here, you could paint this, you could paint there. And he's painting this young man named Santiago, did this beautiful painting that Mike was describing of this, Holy Family in a bus. And he goes, I showed him an image. It was an image I'd seen online as a reference for the Holy Family. And let me find it. And so he's like pulling it up, and he like shows it. He goes, yeah, see, it was this image. And I was like, Father Yerrick, I painted that. He goes, no. He goes, what? He was like freaking out. He did like a little like, it was beautiful. And so he's like looking at it and looking at me and like all confused. It was really like a full circle moment, because you were considering having there, and little did he know that I was the person that painted this.
He was being hospitable to this random artist.
Yeah. And just, I should say, to Santiago's credit, he did this beautiful kind of version of it, and a beautiful version of it, but little elements of the painting I had done.
Yeah, like the puffy jacket.
Yeah.
Joseph is wearing. It's basically the same.
Yeah.
But it was just sort of this serendipitous moment, and that's Father Yerrick in some ways. He's just this wonderful, like lovely, inspirited person who then went, wait, Gustavo, you did a Gustavo. You must go in our wall.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
it was that lovely. But I think that's part of it's interesting. Sometimes I think about like 30, 40 years ago, theologians would sometimes still end up on the cover of Time magazine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was this sense that like, and even preachers could have this like influence in our society. And in a lot of ways, that's really like, there's not gonna be a theologian on the cover of Time magazine anytime soon in these days. But the work that you're doing, I think, has that capacity. It has the capacity to make people go, oh, wait, maybe faith wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not this system of concretized belief that I have to fully ascribe to, where it only affects a very particular way of being in the world that I don't identify with.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe faith is meant to challenge all of that. And so to see work inspired by your work show up in an immigrant shelter, for me, is just exactly what the work of faithfulness is about today. Any other questions from the group?
I just had a comment that what I love about your Instagram page is how you say a little bit about who you're depicting, and then some of it was for books.
Yeah.
And the painting of yours that made me stop in my church was Dorothy Day and the Holy Family.
Yeah. Really good. We got to go. Evie had spent a lot of time in the Catholic Worker in Denver. Dorothy Day has been very important to both of us. And what was really beautiful is we actually got to go, the place that's depicted there is Mary House Catholic Worker in New York City. And early last year, a lot of people don't know this, but her room's still there intact. They didn't touch anything. They maybe changed a few things. So we spent time with the community, which was beautiful. But at the end, we got to go up to her room. It was so beautiful because she'd taped like newspaper clippings of like Van Gogh paintings and like Gauguin, and like she had icons on her wall, and she had all these amazing like Dostoevsky books everywhere, and like all this stuff. It was just beautiful to see. She still had phone numbers of people she loved on on her desk that had been taped down. It was just really beautiful because in the same way, she was putting the images, the things that she wanted to see every day to remind her of her mission and her vocation and finding Christ in least of these. Like she wanted the things in her room to remind her of that. It was just like so striking to see that for Evie and I.
So, Ellen, last question.
Family wellness for the question. Talk about your impressions of the workshop experience yesterday.
Yeah.
I think people would like to hear.
Yeah. Well, I think as what's really beautiful, and I kind of take that and say one last thing too. So, really, and I was asking, what is church art for? I think we're like inundated in our time with images, social media, billboards, advertising, TV, whatever. We're just inundated all day long. But what I think what icons can do in the work of creating them, but also just sacred art in general, they can teach us how to observe, not be so quick to speak into something. When we observe in the context of community, I think it can change us. There was one icon I did was called, when I first started out, I was trying to paint Christ the Pantocrator. He's doing a hand and he's holding a gospel book. And this is ridiculous, but I was still a new painter. And so I couldn't get his hands right. And they were like really tiny. So I ended up calling it Baby Hands Jesus, which is terrible. But so I didn't like it. I put it on a shelf. Well, 2 years went by and I got some new gold leaf. And I didn't have anything to try it out on. And so I grabbed that board and I hastily gold leafed over it. But then I looked at it because I'd reworked that painting so much, the face of Christ stood up. And I was like, oh, this is something. Well, 2 priests of mine happened to be coming to my studio that day and they saw it and they're like, oh, that's the cloud of unknowing. I was like, what? And for those who don't know, it's this 14th century book that really, really briefly, this monk who wrote it said that we only can get so far in knowing God, but the more that we put God under a cloud of forgetting or knowing, the closer we'll be to God through our heart and our experience. I was like, oh my God, I had no idea what that book was, but these 2 priests, they named it, they saw it, and therefore it became a new gift. And so I think that just gets at the heart of what I hope that, the icon writing workshop doing and watching each other create these images and how we're looking at color and forms and what it means to us. But also just them naming it, like sometimes we are failing to see the image or failing what to call it, and then naming it, maybe the other around us, each other, our neighbors, can name the racism within me, or the names the way I'm not loving myself, loving my neighbor well, or through all manner of disease ourselves and myself well. And so I really think that. What is the church art for? It's really can be there to help us to see and connect and ask the questions and have the hard conversations and see God in places we would never have known, and in the face of the immigrant and the stranger, but then also in the face that we look in the mirror. So, yeah.
Will you join me in thanking Kelly and Evie for being here?
Thank you.